A story that will surely send chills down your spine is about a daring young American sailor named Tammy Oldham Ashcraft. Back in 1983, when she was just 23 years old, she had quite the adventure. Along with her British beau Richard Sharp, she was tasked with navigating the ocean from Tahiti to San Diego in California on a luxury yacht. But you know how the ocean can be? It's not always smooth sailing. 20 days into the journey, the two lovebirds got ensnared in a Category 4 hurricane, coming with monstrous waves and wicked winds. Even though they stood their ground against the raging waves, the yacht was rolled over like a beach ball as it tumbled between two waves. The last thing etched in Tammy's memory before being knocked out cold for 27 hours is Richard shouting as an enormous wave slammed onto their boat. Later on, she penned down her harrowing ordeal in a book, which was later turned into a movie. Tammy had her fair share of sailing experience under her belt before the fateful journey. She had great navigation skills and had already sailed across the Pacific twice. Setting off from Tahiti to San Diego, they initially had a decent journey, but a couple of weeks in, trouble started brewing. They caught wind of a tropical area down by Panama, and before they knew it, the storm was charging west and gathering intensity. The pair made efforts to reach the safety zone, but the hurricane was moving at incredible speed. As fate would have it, the usually short-lived hurricane kept going. Facing giant waves and hurricane winds is enough to give anyone nightmares. The boat took a hammering, and despite their best preparations, dealing with such rough seas was a monumental task. The boat would leap into the air over the towering waves and come crashing down, making the whole structure shudder. Richard was in the cockpit, secured with a safety harness as they bobbed over the massive waves. But then, they ran into rogue waves. Those monstrous anomalies that come out of nowhere. One such wave made the boat do a 360-degree flip, and that was the last thing Tammy remembered. When she came to her senses, Richard was nowhere to be found. The safety harnesses meant to keep him attached to the boat were ruptured. With no one nearby to pick up her distress signals, Tammy was left with a non-functioning long-distance radio after 2 weeks of relentless battering from the sea. All she had was a short-range, very high-frequency VHF radio, which gave up after 5 days due to water damage. She was alone and completely cut off. Tammy had to rely on her basic tools to navigate to Hawaii, a sextant and sight reduction tables. Using the sun's position, she determined her latitude, and once she found her watch, she could also figure out her longitude. It took a while, but she did make it to Hawaii. Throughout her time being lost at sea, Tammy showed just how resourceful she was. She remembered trying to get the engine running, but some of the boat's parts had melted onto the propeller shaft. Despite being mechanically inclined, she couldn't waste time trying to fix something that was potentially beyond repair. Instead, she relied on her training as a bosun. Tammy also kept a log of her time at sea, always aware that if she didn't make it, this might be the only clue to what happened. Looking back on the log, she admitted that her mental state had been fragile during her ordeal. Despite everything, Tammy shared that the human survival instinct is incredibly strong. She wanted to live. The hero of our next tale is a man named Steve Callahan. His story, though it sounds like a Hollywood movie script, is real as real can be. Back in 1982, Steve found himself participating in a single-handed sailing race across the vast Atlantic Ocean. He trusted his voyage to a self-designed vehicle, proudly named Napoleon Solo. It was a sturdy, reliable boat, built to weather storms and defy waves. But unpredictable weather loomed in, tearing into the race fleet and sinking a bunch of boats. Steve had to sideline himself and dock his beloved Napoleon Solo in Spain for some urgent repairs. After patching up the boat, Steve took off again, this time setting his sights on the Canary Islands. His heart was set on crossing the Atlantic and reaching the sandy shores of Antigua. Sadly, his boat was battered by strong winds, leaving it significantly damaged. Steve found himself with no choice but to abandon the ship. He soon boarded an inflatable life raft. Steve decided he wasn't going down without a fight. Before Napoleon Solo sank into the depths of the Atlantic, he dived repeatedly into the turbulent waters to salvage what he could. With a few essential items secured, he battled hunger, thirst, and loneliness for the next 76. Some fishermen eventually found him and whisked him off to a local hospital where he began his recovery. Now you might think this is where Steve's story ends. His incredible saga of survival was shared far and wide in sailing magazines, featured on numerous TV shows, and finally cemented in his own book. But the record for the longest time ever spent lost at sea was broken by a man named Jose Salvador Alvarenga. He is an incredibly tough soul whose tenacity and will to survive would become the stuff of legends. That's because for 438 long, difficult days, he was adrift. A fisherman by trade, Jose was no stranger to the sea's unpredictable moods. His life's most terrifying adventure started on a day just like any other, in 2012. That was the day Jose and his fishing mate headed off the shores of a quaint fishing village named Costa Azul in Mexico. It was their first voyage together. Life, however, had a nasty surprise in store for them. Soon after they had left the comfort of the shoreline behind, they were ambushed by a furious storm. It tossed their small boat about like a toy, steering it off its course. Their ship's motor and most of their onboard electronics were rendered useless. Jose, displaying his quick thinking, managed to radio his boss for help before the communication device gave up, but the response was as powerless as their situation. For 5 relentless days, the storm messed with them. When the skies finally cleared, Jose and his mate found themselves lost, with no idea of their whereabouts or how to get back. To make matters worse, the storm had taken away most of their fishing equipment, leaving them with mere basic survival tools. Their boat no longer had sails, motors, or oars. Month after month, they drifted aimlessly. Their sustenance came from good old Mother Nature, rainwater, and a random collection of sea critters like fish, turtles, and birds. After about 4 months, Jose lost his friend, but he decided to carry on, in hopes he'd one day be rescued. Little did he know, he was nowhere near the end of his journey. He attempted signaling every passing ship he saw, but his desperate cries for help were useless. Relying solely on rainwater and whatever the sea offered him for food, Jose kept track of his days by the changing phases of the moon. It was a bit over a year after the disastrous storm that Jose finally sighted land. His heart filled with hope, and he abandoned his trusty but worn-out boat, choosing to swim towards the shore. To his amazement, he found himself on one of the Marshall Islands, situated on the far side of the Pacific from where his ordeal had begun. The man was taken to a hospital where he slowly but steadily recovered his strength. Upon his return, his family declared they had never given up on him and were over the moon on the news of his discovery. However, this survival story was so fantastical that many raised their eyebrows in doubt. Could a man really survive for so long at sea on a tiny boat? However, there were those who offered a counterpoint. Experts explained that fresh meat from birds and turtles, which Alvarenga claimed to have consumed in plenty, contained enough vitamin C to ensure survival.
Back in May 2015, David Hull took his metal detector and went looking for gold. He picked the perfect spot for it. Mayabura near Melbourne, Australia, was the top location down under during the gold rush in the 19th century. The detector beeped, showing there was something precious hiding in the ground. David found a very heavy reddish rock with a weird, dimpled surface resting in some yellow clay. As it turned out later, the find was indeed priceless, but only for science. David took the rock home, hoping he'd be able to open it and find a gold nugget inside. He tried a rock saw, an angle grinder, and a drill, and put the rock in acid. Nothing worked. Not even a sledgehammer did the job. A couple of years later, he decided to take the rock to Melbourne Museum and finally find out what it really was. It turned out it was a meteorite, and a rare one. The geologist working at the museum was over the moon, as after years of looking at thousands of rocks that people had thought to be meteorites, he finally got his hands on the real thing. The space origin of the rock explained why it was so unusually heavy. It contained dense forms of iron and nickel, and those guys weigh a lot. And it got its dimpled surface because it started melting when it plunged through Earth's atmosphere. Scientists named the meteorite Marabro after the place where it was found and used a diamond saw to study it better. They sliced off a sliver of the space rock and saw some tiny crystallized droplets of metallic minerals throughout it. Those minerals formed during the early years of our solar system. It means the space guest was around 4.6 billion years old. The researchers are still not quite sure where the meteorite came from or how long it's been on Earth, but they've got some guesses. Our solar system used to be a swirling mix of dust and chondrite rocks. Gravity did its thing and formed planets, but there were some leftovers, and most of them ended up in a massive asteroid belt. The Maebro meteorite likely took a detour from the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. It got bumped out of there by asteroids crashing into each other, and one fine day, it decided to crash into Earth. Carbon dating says that this space rock has been chilling on Earth for somewhere between 100 and 1,000 years. There were meteorite sightings in the 19th century that could match up with when it made its grand entrance. The scientists say the Maebro meteorite is even rarer than gold. It's only the 17th meteorite ever found in the Australian state of Victoria and the second largest. In the 80s, David Mazurek from Michigan decided to buy a farm not far from Mount Pleasant. The new property came with a weird bonus: a large rock that kept the barn door open. The farmer explained the rock was a meteorite. It had literally fallen from the sky in the 30s. The farmer and his father found the crater the meteorite had left and dug out their guest from space, which was still warm. They couldn't think of a better use for it than to serve as a doorstop. I mean, what else can you do with a meteorite? The new owner got to keep the unconventional doorstop and must have grown fond of it. When he was moving to a new home, he took the rock with him and used it for the same purpose for another 30 years. Sometimes David would let his kids take it to school. It must have gotten some easy A's in physics and astronomy. Then he heard that other Michigan residents find and sell pieces of meteorites for some serious cash. Since his piece was an impressive 22 pounds, he decided to take it to Central Michigan University to find out its value. A local geology professor was getting tired of similar requests because, for around 18 years, she had to explain to people all the rocks they had brought her weren't meteorites at all. But this time, she felt it was the real thing. She tested the rock and determined it was a meteorite made from iron and nickel. It turned out to be the 6th largest recorded find of this kind in Michigan, and the most valuable specimen she's ever worked with. They sent a slice for another round of verification to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and soon it was all official. It turned out that the meteorite was a piece of an early solar system. The Smithsonian and a museum in Maine offered some good money for the space rock. Mazurek decided to sell his meteorite to Michigan State University's Abrams Planetarium for $75,000. He generously shared 10% of the money with Central Michigan University's Earth and Atmospheric Sciences Department, where they confirmed the rock's true identity. I hope the money he was left with was enough to buy a new doorstop. While some use meteorites as furniture, scientists have found a way to utilize them to extract oxygen from water on Mars. Traveling to the red planet is impossible without oxygen. We need it both to breathe and fuel rockets for a return trip to Earth. The new robot, called AI Chemist, hunts down a compound that can kickstart a chemical reaction on Mars to produce oxygen. The compound is crafted from elements found in Martian meteorites. This planet only has traces of oxygen in its atmosphere. But scientists have found there's some liquid water underneath the southern ice cap of Mars and more water under its surface. So, they needed to figure out how to break down this water into its hydrogen and oxygen molecules using materials available on the red planet. The AI chemist analyzed 5 meteorites that either came from Mars or were similar to that of its surface. It used a laser to locate large amounts of iron, nickel, calcium, magnesium, aluminum, and manganese in the samples. These elements will be enough to produce more than 3.7 million possible molecules to break down water and generate oxygen on the red planet. Finding the right algorithm for this process would take us humans around 2,000 years. and the robot managed to do it in a matter of weeks. Using the meteorite compound as a catalyst, the robot managed to do its job in negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit on Earth, and it did so without any human help at all. Now, the question is, if it will be able to do the same on Mars, where the atmospheric composition, air density, humidity, gravity, and other conditions are trickier than on Earth. Other scientists previously managed to produce small amounts of oxygen fit for breathing up there. An instrument the size of a lunchbox on NASA's Perseverance rover compressed and heated carbon dioxide from Mars's atmosphere. It generated oxygen at around the same speed as a small tree. I think Matt Damon's character from The Martian would have loved all these advances in space science. Thousands of meteorites crash into our planet every year. 95% of them are thought to come from just two sources. 75% from the crust of a big asteroid, and 20% from the mantle of an even larger celestial body that bit the dust ages ago. But in May 2020, researchers stumbled upon some meteorite pieces in the Sahara Desert that were like nothing they'd seen before. They were labeled as ungrouped chondrites, a type of rock that formed from melted minor planets way back in the solar system's early days. This makes the find slightly older than Earth itself. But unlike others of its kind, this meteorite was made out of andesite, which made it even more unique. It could serve as proof that the early protoplanets in the solar system and a ton of other debris either got wrecked or joined forces in building the rocky planets we know today.
Care to hear an incredible story about a man who doesn't sleep? Meet the hero of our tale, Thai Nguc Thai Niop, an 80-year-old farmer from Vietnam. If what he says is true, he hasn't snoozed a bit in over 60 years. It all started when he had a terrible bout of fever as a young man, and since then, he claims he hasn't had a single night of rest. Most of us can't even imagine going through a whole day without a few hours of shut-eye. But this man insists that his lack of sleep hasn't affected his life in any negative way. In fact, he leads a happy and active lifestyle, much like anyone else his age. His family, friends, and even his neighbors vouch for him, stating that they have never witnessed him dozing off. The man firmly believes that his complete sleeplessness hasn't had any detrimental impact on his health. This unusual farmer was born in 1942, and at the age of 20, was struck by a severe fever. Although he managed to overcome the episode, he never regained his ability to sleep. Despite trying different medications and traditional remedies, sleep continued to elude him. He held on to the hope that his insomnia would eventually pass. But little did he know that he would go on without sleep for a remarkable 6 decades. His story became something of a legend in his home country of Vietnam, often regarded as a miraculous feat or an extraordinary superpower. However, some doctors offer an alternative perspective. One specialist suggested that the farmer may actually be experiencing short bouts of sleep without realizing it. At times, such individuals struggle to differentiate between being awake and being asleep. So it's possible that this man might be catching some snoozy time during quick power naps throughout the day. Perhaps these brief moments of rest are sufficient to keep him going. It's important to note that he has never consented to undergo thorough testing or observation by sleep scientists, which means his claims and the accounts of those close to him are the only evidence available. Nonetheless, he isn't the only person who claims they haven't slept for several decades. One Asian woman, for instance, claimed to have been sleepless for a staggering 40 years, too. She has become something of a local celebrity due to her unusual ability to stay awake night after night. Just like the Vietnamese farmer, she claims to have been able to sleep properly at one point, but hasn't done so since childhood. At first, her neighbors were skeptical, assuming she was simply exaggerating or seeking attention. To test her claims, they attempted to stay up with her, engaging in late-night games and other activities. Some of them dozed off at the table, while others eventually gave up and returned to their homes. Even her own husband attests to the fact that he has never witnessed his wife sleeping. Instead of catching some well-deserved rest, she busies herself with household chores during the night hours. Concerned for her well-being, her husband went as far as getting her medicine, convinced that the woman had a severe condition. Unfortunately, the remedy proved to be ineffective, leaving the couple perplexed and seeking medical help. When she finally sought assistance from local doctors, they provided little to no relief, since they were unable to offer a medical explanation for this extraordinary condition. In a fortunate turn of events, the woman's search for answers led her to a specialist sleep center. It was there that the puzzle of her sleepless nights began to unravel. As she engaged in a conversation with her husband under the watchful eyes of doctors, they made a remarkable observation. Her eyes began to slow down, and she actually fell asleep while maintaining her dialogue with her husband. Further examination using a brainwave monitor revealed an astonishing fact. The woman's eyes remained closed for no longer than 10 minutes each day. This peculiar phenomenon bears resemblance to how sleepwalkers operate, where the body remains active while the brain slumbers. Essentially, her body continues to function even while she technically sleeps for those fleeting 10 minutes. This intriguing discovery sheds light on why such people genuinely feel as if they haven't experienced a good night's sleep in ages. Most of us don't have these unique abilities, though, and find it hard to get through the day if we haven't gotten a good night's sleep. Why? Because sleep allows our body to recharge, heal, and perform important functions. Ideally, adults should aim for around 7 to 8 hours of sleep every night. Let's take a closer look at what happens to our bodies during longer periods of time without sleep. It's not uncommon to go without sleep for 24 hours, and while it won't cause major problems, you can expect to feel tired and a bit off. After a whole day of being awake, you may feel drowsy, irritable, and have difficulty concentrating. You may start to crave some food too, and your eyes will definitely show that you're tired. Once you've been awake for 36 hours, the signs become more intense. You'll have an overwhelming urge to sleep, and you may even have short periods of sleep, known as microsleeps, without realizing it. These microsleeps usually last up to 30 seconds. During this stage, different parts of your brain will struggle to communicate with each other. You may find it difficult to remember certain things and to learn new information. After 48 hours, it might become even harder to stay awake, and you're more likely to experience episodes of microsleep. So, how long does it take to recover from such instances? Well, the good news is that you can bounce back by prioritizing sleep and allowing your body to rest. To start the process, it's recommended to establish a consistent sleep schedule. Try going to bed earlier rather than sleeping in late, and aim for a minimum of 7 hours of sleep each night. This will help your body get back into a suitable sleep routine. Take into account that it might take time to get back to normal, ranging from days to weeks, depending on the duration of your sleepless episode. As a general rule, for every hour of sleep loss, it may take approximately 4 days to fully recover. There are some additional steps you can take to bounce back as soon as possible. For instance, if you've only missed a few hours of sleep, taking a nap can certainly help. However, it's important to keep your nap short, around 30 minutes or less. Make a nice routine for yourself whenever you're planning to snooze. This might mean creating a comfortable sleep environment, avoiding stimulating activities before bed, and limiting exposure to light. Scientists are always discovering cool things about how our brains work. But do you ever wonder what happens to our incredible brain when we sleep? First of all, we know that every living creature, from tiny fruit flies to jellyfish, sleeps. This activity is also special because it has some costs. When animals sleep, they can be vulnerable to other, more powerful creatures. The brain is especially affected by not getting enough sleep. There are 2 types of sleep that our brains go through. One is called rapid eye movement, REM sleep, and the other is non-REM sleep. They each have different brain waves and activities happening in our brains. Non-REM sleep happens when we start falling asleep. Our brain waves slow down, our muscles relax, and our breathing becomes slower. REM sleep is interesting because our brain waves during this time look very similar to when we are awake. This is when we have the most bizarre dreams. The thalamus, an important part of our brain, sends images, sounds, and other sensations that create our dreams during REM sleep. There's a chemical called acetylcholine that is pretty strong during REM sleep. It's also active when we are awake, and it helps our brain remember things. That's why studying before bedtime and sleeping on it can help us remember things better the next day. When we fall asleep, our brain has these special patterns of brain waves called spine spindles. They are still not fully understood, but scientists think they play a role in learning and remembering new things. They might also help us stay asleep, even if there are noises or other distractions around us.
On a rainy evening in a dark, dense forest, you hear the crunch of branches. Your heart starts beating faster. You're afraid to look in the direction of the sound, but you're still slowly turning your head. A feeling of horror freezes you. You can't escape, and you're sure that some animal is looking at you now. By this point, it stopped raining. An ominous silence has fallen over the forest. The clouds disperse, and the dim light from the full moon illuminates the trees, among which you notice a human silhouette. He's tall and is hiding in the shadows. He isn't moving, waiting for your next actions. Two glowing red eyes light up his dark face. Terrified, you point the flashlight beam at the monster. The scary creature opens its wide wings and flies away into the night. You've just seen the Mothman, one of America's most famous monsters. This is an urban legend, but the monster really exists and doesn't exist at the same time. It all started in West Virginia, in the small town of Point Pleasant in the early 20th century. It was an industrial place with factories producing harmful toxic substances. Closer to the 50s, all these plants were closed, but people didn't dispose of waste from the factories properly. Therefore, harmful substances began to penetrate the surrounding nature and pollute forests and water. These events became a prologue to the appearance of the Mothman. For the first time, city residents heard about the monster in the 60s. 4 young people were driving past the dark forest and stopped by a local power plant. There, they saw a big man with red eyes and wide wings, like those of a moth. The teenagers were terrified and immediately drove away from that place. They came to the local sheriff and told him everything that had happened. The police quickly examined the forest and the area near the station, searching for the monster, but found nothing. Meanwhile, a local newspaper wrote an article about it. Soon, other people also began to report that they had seen a mysterious creature. Some thought the Mothman was a human or an animal that mutated after getting poisoned by toxic substances. These rumors were nothing but fairy tales from sci-fi movies. So, people started ignoring these stories after a while. Then, after the monster's first appearance, a catastrophe happened in the city. The Silver Bridge, the main road to Point Pleasant, couldn't withstand the traffic before the winter holidays. The bridge collapsed under the heavy weight and many cars fell down. The tragedy brought a lot of grief to the town, and people were trying to figure out how could this happen. Some suggested that the crash could be related to the Mothman. No, he didn't destroy the bridge, but people said they had seen this creature many times before the tragedy. It looked like the Mothman was a harbinger of trouble. Further investigation revealed that the road collapsed because of poor bridge maintenance. But this version faded amid the rumors about the Mothman. After the crash, reports about the Mothman stopped. People no longer saw the monster and forgot about it. But then, in the 70s, author John Keel wrote a book about the mysterious monster from Point Pleasant. He liked discussing stories about extraterrestrial civilizations and other urban legends, so he couldn't miss the case of the Mothman. He wrote about how the unknown beast could be an unconscious premonition of Point Pleasant's inhabitants of the tragedy on the bridge. The book became popular all over the US. John Keel made the Mothman a superstar. Hollywood created a movie based on the book, and the small town became the center of attraction for thousands of tourists. The Mothman has become as popular as the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot. People organize an annual festival in honor of this character. If earlier the beast was a harbinger of disaster, now it's become the cause of the economic growth of Point Pleasant. Tourists come to get in touch with the legend and spend a lot of money. Locals open cafes and hotels, organize tours, and make souvenirs. One sculptor even installed a sinister monster statue. The Mothman has evolved from local myth to a brand. In this case, it turns out that even though he doesn't exist, it's not entirely true. Many messages about the Mothman appear all over the world. It's said that people see him shortly before major disasters, but of course, it's yet to be proven. One guy did research and found out that all the books and materials about the Mothman were written by fans of myths and urban legends, and that there was not a single scientific proof or observation that the monster really existed. Now, remember the events associated with the Mothman? The collapse of the bridge? The release of toxic substances and other tragedies? The flying creature with red eyes has become the embodiment of mass hysteria. When many people are under stress or grief, they may experience the same unconscious reaction. In such a depressed state, people really begin to believe and see things that don't exist. A similar feeling appears during a strike or other mass events. You may disagree with the majority opinion, but when you find yourself in a crowd that demands something, you seem to be infected by their mood. This is quite a typical thing for our mentality. When you're experiencing grief along with hundreds and thousands of people around, your brain becomes sensitive to any information. You may see a large heron or an owl in this state and mistake it for the Mothman. And other people will unknowingly support you and believe in the monster. There have been many cases of mass hysteria in the world. One of the most striking ones happened in France in the 16th century when the inhabitants of Strasbourg began to dance for several weeks. This event is called the Dancing Plague. At first, one woman started dancing in the city's central square. A week later, other locals joined her, infected with her bout of sinister fun. According to one version, the mass dancing hysteria began against a backdrop of hunger and diseases that Europe was experiencing at that time. People were under constant stress, and their minds decided to relieve stress in an unusual way. Another version says that people were poisoned by some fungus that grew on wheat grains. The fungus somehow affected people's psyche and made them dance. But let's get back to our monster. In addition to the stress associated with the collapse of the bridge and the release of toxic waste in the forest, people could have been impressed by herons and owls. People called the Mothman bird-like in the first reports because of his red eyes and wings. Therefore, some researchers claimed that the residents of Point Pleasant had seen a big heron or a sandhill crane with wide wings and red markings around the eyes. The sandhill crane doesn't live in West Virginia, but it can fly over this territory and even make a stop there to have a snack. Also, people could have seen a giant owl sitting in a tree. The eyes of these animals can glow red at night. People reported seeing about 28 cranes from 2017 to 2019. Imagine living in a city where shops, streets, and monuments remind you of the Mothman. People have been talking about him for years, believing in him. And then you see a giant heron in the forest. Surely the first thing you'll think about is the Mothman. So people may be telling the truth when they say they've seen him, or at least they might believe they're telling the truth. In any case, the Mothman is neither a product of an extraterrestrial civilization, nor a radioactive mutant animal. People created this creature with their minds and faith. Such things always attract people because they give us the feeling that we know something that most people don't. Something mysterious. Additionally, the Mothman brings a lot of money to the residents of Point Pleasant, and it's much more profitable for them to support the rumors about the monster than to prove that it doesn't exist.
Once every couple of months, you have bouts of hiccuping that last 10 to 20 minutes, and you think that it's horrible? Oh, my sweet summer child. Imagine hiccuping for 68 years straight. How would you like this? A man named Charles Osborne had quite a funny way of talking that he developed to hide the sound of his endless hiccups. Poor guy had been hiccuping non-stop starting from June 13th, 1922, for over 68 years. So here's the story. Osborne was born back in 1893, and he started hiccuping after a small accident on a farm in Nebraska. He fell over, but he didn't feel anything weird until he started hiccuping like crazy. Doctors think that the accident might have damaged a small part of his brain that helped stop the hiccup reflex. There are a few different theories about what might have caused his hiccups. Some people think that he might have hurt his ribs during the fall, and that messed with his diaphragm muscle. Others think that he hit his head and had a stroke. Either way, he was stuck with the hiccups for all his remaining life. Can you imagine having 20 to 40 involuntary diaphragm spasms per minute for that long? By the time Osborn finally stopped hiccuping, he had probably done it about 430 million times in total during all his 97-year-long life. It was so bad that he saw a number of doctors, sometimes traveling quite far, but nobody could fix it. One doctor even tried to help him by putting him on a mix of carbon monoxide and oxygen, and it helped for a bit, but that ended up being a bad idea, since breathing in the poison gas wasn't a safe solution. Instead, Osborn had to learn a special breathing technique to minimize the hic sound that came with each spasm. He'd breathe in between hiccups and flex his chest a few times per minute to suppress the noise. It was still obvious that he was hiccuping since he'd heave and jerk, but at least it wasn't as loud. Osborn had been hiccuping for 56 years when he became famous by giving an interview in 1978. He said that he'd do anything to get rid of the hiccups, and that he didn't even know what it would be like to not have them. He was constantly sore from all the jerking and spasming. After speaking up, he got a lot of attention in the media. He was even listed in the Guinness World Records and appeared on TV shows like The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, and that's incredible. People from all over the country sent him letters with suggestions for how to cure the hiccups, but none of them worked for more than a little while. But this ordeal didn't stop Charles Osborn from living a relatively normal life. People knew him as a happy-go-lucky guy who loved cracking jokes and didn't talk much about his condition. He married twice and had 8 children. He sold farm machinery and auctioned off livestock for living. In 1990, for reasons that are still a mystery, Osborn's hiccups suddenly stopped after over 6 decades. Unfortunately, he passed away just a year later. I bet, however, that his last months were really happy because they were finally hiccup-free. Despite all the medical advancements made since Osborn's time, there is still no surefire way to cure prolonged hiccuping. Hiccups are a strange phenomenon that have been around since the dawn of mammalian existence. We still don't fully understand why they happen or what purpose they serve. Researchers are slowly uncovering the answers to 2 key questions. Why do hiccups occur in the first place? And how can we stop them? Hiccups are a reflex action, similar to the way your leg jerks when a doctor taps your knee with a hammer. This reflex is found in many mammals, from household pets like dogs and cats to larger animals like horses and rabbits. When you hiccup, a nerve signal travels from your diaphragm, which is the muscle located at the bottom of your lungs, to your brain and back again. This process is repeated multiple times, causing your diaphragm to contract and your lungs to expand. However, in the middle of the inhale, a reflex causes your epiglottis, which is a flap of tissue that sits at the top of your throat, to suddenly snap shut, creating the characteristic hic sound. This is how the sudden closure of vocal cords sounds. This cycle continues until the reflex is interrupted by something like holding your breath or drinking water. Hiccuping is caused by the phrenic nerve, which is a long and oddly shaped cord that goes from the chest to the diaphragm. It first appeared in mammals' ancestors that were fish-like, but theirs was shorter and connected straight to the gills next to the brain instead of going all the way to the diaphragm. The reflex of hiccups might have been useful for amphibians that lived on land, as they needed to switch between breathing underwater with gills and breathing in the air with lungs. The epiglottis flap closed and thus sent water into their mouth and gills, keeping it from going to lungs. However, since humans no longer live underwater and do not have gills, why do hiccups still exist in us? They may have other benefits. For example, babies tend to hiccup more often than adults, especially while suckling milk. As they drink, they also swallow air, and the hiccups might be the body's way of clearing the air from the stomach. This reflex might work like a self-initiated burp. Interestingly, it's not just young infants who hiccup a lot. Even fetuses as young as 10 weeks old have been observed hiccuping. This process might serve to train fetuses' brains to map out their internal body. In other words, they need to learn where their diaphragm is located and how to control their breathing, and hiccups might help them practice breathing so they're ready when they're born. Approximately 4,000 people seek medical attention for hiccups each year in the United States. How to get rid of hiccups is one of the most commonly searched health questions on Google. Most hiccups resolve by themselves within 2 days, but longer-lasting bouts could indicate an underlying problem such as a brain tumor. Sometimes patients face continuous hiccups that don't go away even after medical treatment, known as intractable hiccups. In such cases, only treatment of the underlying condition helps. To address hiccups, doctors have tried different medications that aim to relax muscles and nerves that may cause diaphragm spasms, but there isn't enough clear evidence to recommend a specific treatment. There's a Japanese research group that has discovered a new method of curing hiccups, and it involves breathing in high-concentration CO2. It tricks the brain into thinking there's a life-threatening emergency, causing it to forget about the hiccups. However, if you can't travel to Japan for this treatment, you can try some old wives' tales that have been proven to work, like drinking a whole glass of water in one gulp, standing on your head, or getting really scared. These methods work by interrupting the reflex arc, so the nerves and muscles are distracted by something else. This is a conclusion made by Ali Sifi, a neurointensivist who became obsessed with finding a cure after seeing a patient wake up with unexplainable hiccups after brain surgery. Drinking water quickly, for instance, forces the diaphragm to keep creating suction, which keeps the phrenic nerve occupied. It interrupts one part of the reflex. Similarly, getting scared, for example, activates the vagus nerve, which has a calming effect, thereby interrupting the other part of the reflex. Ali Saif has created a tool called the Hickaway, which is more consistent than the traditional methods because it helps to combine both effects. It looks like a straw that requires the drinker to suck very hard, like drinking a thick milkshake, engaging both nerves and effectively ending the hiccups.